can't see that. So we got Jordan on there. Oh, are we up to speed?
1 second.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay. So we're up to speed. I don't see Daniel on the call yet, but I guess he can chime in as we go. So I'll call the Water Committee meeting to order. And we'll roll down to the management report, which is Water Committee Management Report dated July 2020 for receipt.
Move receipt. Second.
Okay, and any questions or comments on that? Seeing none and seeing no one opposed, we can move on to reports, which is the Comox Valley. Sorry, I have to move my glasses up and down each time because I can't see both at the same time. So advisory committee. So minutes of the Comox Valley Water Management Advisory Committee held July 2nd for receipt.
Second.
And any questions or comments on that? Seeing none, is there anyone opposed to receipt? And seeing none, we'll consider that good. And we will move on to COVID-19 response and renewal, Comox Valley Water System. Staff reported report dated July 9th, 2020 regarding COVID-19 response and renewal plan for the Comox Valley Water System for receipt.
Move receipt.
Second.
And we're going to pass that on to Chris, are we?
First, I'll give a bit of an
go ahead, yep.
introduction, Chair and committee members. You'll recall that the board gave us direction as staff to review all of our services and come up to you with recommendations with respect to how we could respond to the principles that you adopted with respect to renewal in light of COVID and the recovery period. This is the report with respect to this water system, and Chris LaRose, our senior manager, has put his mind to this with his staff to come up with suggestions and ideas for your consideration. If you adopt these, it will go before the board in their strategic planning session, along with all other service reviews and renewal plans in September, so that the board can take affirmative action to support its community as it recovers from the COVID circumstance. So Chris will present his report and answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Russell. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Russell mentioned, all services have been asked to prepare a renewal plan, a COVID renewal plan with a focus on finding cost savings, efficiencies, innovations, collaborations to help the community through the recovery phase of this crisis. So we've gone through the financial plan for the Service 300 and settled on a list of proposed savings, which savings and collaborations, which is summarized in Appendix A. So I'll just walk through those quickly. So the first item was water conservation rebate. So last year we had included an increased amount, an allowance for rebates in anticipation of releasing a new rebate, which we plan to do early this year. However, with the pandemic, we've put those plans on hold. So that leaves some room there. So an additional $50,000 per year that we can claw back to help contribute to the overall savings package here. The second one is travel, staff travel. We're proposing, given that travel has been significantly curtailed by the crisis, there's some easy savings there. Similarly for training and development, much of which of the kind of the significant costs add up from travel, conferences, that type of thing, all of which are on hold for now. And we're proposing to reduce our allowances in engineering services and minor capital. Again, further temporarily reduce them. So these are typically there to provide some wiggle room should there be some unforeseen repair work or some type of event that requires that budget. So we think we can temporarily reduce these with only a modest elevated risk of budget exceedances and a corresponding reduction in reserve contributions. The next one was a water restrictions enforcement. So we transitioned that position from a contract role to a staff one last year. And this one was a relic, actually, an omission. It should have been taken out. So that one is an easy $20,000 reduction. And then moving forward for that internal position, we are proposing to trial in 2021, see about using the internal CVRD bylaw enforcement team for enforcement and education relating to the water conservation bylaw, rather than having a dedicated staff member. Again, so some collaboration there interdepartmentally and some savings. We're proposing to, we have actually transitioned to doing our safe work procedures internally. So we're proposing to remove that allowance for that work. And then second to last is making use of vehicles for 7 years instead of 5. So this will be done on a trial basis for the next couple of years. We expect minimal impacts as the vehicles do seem to be holding their value better. And in the interim, over that trial period, we'll work to support a more corporate review of the vehicle replacement policy to see if that's something that should be implemented permanently. And then lastly, the Watershed Protection Plan. So in a service of this type, which is focused on a core delivery of an essential service like water, we have struggled a little bit to identify any significant savings given the nature of our work. The Watershed Protection Plan, while very crucial work, this did kind of rise to the top as being an opportunity where some of those costs associated with professional fees associated with addressing the Watershed Protection Plan recommendations can be deferred by a couple of years. And so that's our single biggest line item here for savings does come from the WPP. And what that'll look like is a delay of 2 years to our proper functioning condition assessment. So this is our plan to methodically go through the watershed and assess each of the sub watersheds for the ecosystem health and prioritization for any type of restoration or protection. So that's one big piece, and then the other is relating to the education and outreach. So we're proposing to reduce that budget over the next 2 years to provide a little bit of breathing room in the financial plan. So these add up to approximately $280,000 per year, and we're proposing to do this for this year, next year, and ending in 2022. So our proposed approach is that the bulk of these savings be used to reduce the bulk water rate for 2021 and 2022, and allowing this to happen without requiring higher than anticipated rates in the years after that, and that the remainder be used to strengthen the reserve balance, providing some additional buffer should we see lower than expected revenues for the service or other unanticipated COVID-related impacts. So exactly how these savings will be passed on to the users will differ between jurisdictions. And while this approach will help to relieve financial pressure on residents in the short term, it will make the rate increase in 2023, which is already planned, an increase up to 96 cents, feel that much larger. So just wanted to make sure that was understood. So while the staff feel that a rate decrease is likely the best use of the short-term savings in light of all the cumulative impacts on residents at this time, we have also included an alternate should the committee decide it wants to take a different approach, which will be to direct us to keep the existing rate schedule and use the savings using the full savings to further strengthen the reserve balance in the event that revenues or costs are negatively impacted by the pandemic or any indirect economic consequences. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of this.
Right. We have a question from Director Hamir.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chair, and thanks to Chris for the report. I'm a little bit hesitant about that big jump in water rates in 2023, it looks like. Would you have an idea what that would look like for an individual household to have that, what was it, a 16-cent jump in a water rate?
Yeah, so if you'll think back to February, March, when we brought forward the I think it was roughly at the same time as the financial plan was brought forward this year, we did bring forward the recommendation that, the recommendation that that the rates, or I guess it was more of a heads up that the rates would need to increase at the end of the 5 years beyond what they were previously predicted to be. And that was, at the time, we explained that this was not due to a higher than expected or anticipated costs in those years. In fact, the revenue requirements for the service have stayed consistent with our predictions from 2, 3, or 4 years ago. But rather they've been driven by a decrease in the projected consumption from the municipalities. And so the answer to your question is complicated. So in the municipalities who really will be looking to cover a similar share of a similar amount of revenue requirements for the service, those residents will not likely see an impact from that bulk water rate if the projections for consumption bear out. It's a little bit more of a direct relationship with the rates in the rural areas, where our practice has been to increase the unit rates proportional to the increase to the bulk water rate. So that, again, that has been our practice, but certainly we could, in a different forum through the EASC, we could revisit our approach to how those bulk water rates are borne by the rural service areas.
So if I understand correctly, you're expecting there to be conservation in the future that would sort of negate that big jump in the rates for municipal residents, but in the rural areas, you're not projecting conservation, and so they'll feel the full rate because of that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Kind of, except for the fact that I'm not saying it's due to conservation. But what we've seen is that I mean, although it may be a little bit, but what we're seeing is that our projections for consumption in the rural areas have stayed constant. And if you look 4 years back at what our projections were, they're very similar to what we're currently projecting. But if you look at the projections that have come from the municipalities, they have stepped down significantly. So whether that's from consumption or just from a reassessment of development, it's not totally clear, but the fact remains that their projected consumption is quite a bit lower.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it does sound like there will be an impact, especially for the rural areas, for those on water. So yeah, that would be a concern, I think, for the rural directors. I'm also really hesitant to cut back on the watershed protection plan work. I mean, it's work that can be done during COVID, and I think it's something that the community would really like to see. So, I'm leaning towards not dropping the rates and not cutting that out of the budget. But I'd love to hear what other board members have to say on that specifically. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I got David next. Oh, and welcome, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Well, just on the last comments made by Director Hamir, yeah, I guess I'm always happy to hear that staff have found some efficiencies, even if they're temporary. And with our different situation now, it does seem to make sense to pass that on. But I was kind of wondering what sort of effect an average household in the regional, in a rural area might see. And you mentioned that the municipalities obviously have to decide how they're going to deal with this lower rate, but it's very direct for those households in the rural areas. So can you tell me just rough numbers? Like, are we talking $10? Are we talking $100? Or do you have any idea what that effect would be, this lower rate for the next few years?
Well, if the committee did decide to step the rates down as recommended, then we're looking at a 3 cent this year and a 5 cent lower next year reduction. And so the rates, the volumetric rate is just one part of the charge to the local service area residents. They pay a flat rate and then the per unit rate. So it would that benefit would impact the larger users of water much more significantly than the smaller kind of just single family residential properties who likely, many of which don't actually broach their flat rate. So all that to say, it's hard to say that average and below users would not see a benefit from that reduction, other than potentially slightly higher than currently anticipated reserve contribution, which would benefit everybody in those service areas.
Well, I guess the sentiment is there, and that's important. And I think people do appreciate that. But I would also maybe think that keeping these monies in our reserves could be in the long term more beneficial. So I'm also interested in hearing what the rest of the committee thinks. Thanks.
All right, and then we have Councillor Hillian, or Director Hillian, sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for staff for the report. Two questions. First of all, on page 3, the
third bullet talks about implementing the proposed cost reductions will more than offset reduced capital works reserves and leave the service with 350,000 more in reserves. Could you just explain that to me, how that actually works?
sure, so
Thanks. Still getting used to it too. So just roughly speaking, $280,000 savings per year equates to say roughly $800,000 over those 3 years. And if we're actually only and then the let me just wrap my head around that too. Thank you. Yeah, so we've got savings over 3 years, and then just the reduced capital works reserve contributions for the subsequent 2 years. So that's, which works out to roughly 500,000. So that difference is between 8 and 850,000. Sorry, that difference is between $3 and $350,000 more in reserves. And that's did that make any sense to you?
not really.
Okay.
I guess I don't understand.
Okay, so hang on, Doug, just a sec. If you're, you have to turn your light off, or if you're in the room, or otherwise the flashing one won't come off. So if we have too many lights on, we can't hear you.
Thanks for that. It's I think I've only been here once in the last 4 months, so it's it's a bit of getting used to again. So I don't understand how, if the costs are reduced, first of all, what's the connection between those reduced costs and capital reserve contributions, and why does it leave an increase in those reserves? Because if the costs are being reduced, presumably the money isn't being taxed and spent. Does that make sense?
And apologies for that bungled first explanation there. So I'll try that again. So the issue is that on one hand, we've got a reduced revenue by adjusting the bulk water rate in 2021 and 2022. And per the top bullet on that page, that's approximately a $500,000 reduction in revenue. But we're also highlighting roughly $282,000 savings for actually 3 years, not just those 2. So for this year, as well as those 2 years where the rates are lower than they would be. And so if you look at the total savings, the 282 times 3, and then you subtract the reduced revenue, the difference will end up in as a higher than anticipated reserve contribution, and that's where that 350 is. Maybe that might be slightly high, but like say between 300 and 350 additional reserve contribution. And that's due to the difference between the reduced revenue and the savings.
So the savings goes into reserve.
The net savings once the reduced revenue is considered.
Okay. My other question relates to the 100,000 reduction in the watershed protection program. And I'm just wondering what sort of consultation there's been with our community partners who are involved in that process and the advisory committee, and what sort of feedback, if any, we've received from those community members.
That's a great question. In fact, we haven't consulted with the WAG when conceptualizing these reductions. Yeah.
Then we have Director Swift.
Thank you. I'm also concerned about the drop in the bulk water rates. I think the jump in from 80 cents to 96 cents is too large and would be a real shock to some people. So I'd be more in favor of keeping the current rates and boosting the reserves.
And then Director Will.
Thanks, Chair Ken. I was also had some questions about the big jump from 80 to 96 cents in the bulk water rate. And even if it were the current, it would still be a fairly considerable jump in 2023. It'd be 11 cents from 85 to 96. I'm wondering if it's possible to kind of distribute it over this 5 years, so it's kind of a smooth line, sort of 83 to 85 in 2021 to 87 in 2022 to 91 in 2023 to 96 in 2024. So it's sort of a smooth progression rather than, as I said, even the current plan is an 11-cent increase in 1 year in 2023. So is that something that would be a way of approaching the increase to smooth it out like that?
That's certainly possible. If that's the direction from the water committee, we could definitely adjust the schedule of increases.
So Chris, unless I misunderstood or read this wrong, the savings for the community, for the municipalities would come to the municipality, not necessarily the end user. So in other words, if we wanted to take this reduction, we could smooth that out at our own community or just not give them a break at all if we chose to. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, so the situation with the municipalities is quite different than with the local service areas. So yes, so for both issues, you know, if we do decide to drop the rate down, it's up to the municipalities as to whether and how those savings get passed on to the residents. It could be that you chose not to pass any savings on to the residents and instead use that for some type of reserve, or it could be passed on directly. And also for the separate issue of that big jump, it's also completely up to the municipalities about how you manage that jump as well. You could start collecting more revenue from your users now and smooth it out yourselves, or you could work through the water committee to have us smooth that out more. So for the municipalities, you've got a lot of freedom in terms of how your users experience the water rates.
All right, so this will be a weird question, but can the municipalities do one thing and the electoral areas do something different? Like, because I see that jump in year 3 or whatever it is a big jump for them. But if they could smooth it out in those areas and we could, because I like the idea of getting the savings for our municipalities and letting us do it, but I can see the problem there.
I'll answer that. And that's, yes, each jurisdiction may be able to ride this out or have a different strategy as to how to address it. And certainly, as Chris mentioned previously, that this can be raised at the electoral area committee, as well as Black Creek Oyster Bays, and if I did that, the electoral area committee to review how they respond to this if they feel it is something that needs pre-planning or otherwise. And just to remind the committee that it was the board's direction to look at each and every service, and it isn't easy. It isn't easy to come up with ideas and suggestions that don't have an impact, that you may want some further level of consultation, but The board feels it's very important to come up with some real tangible results of this renewal and to formulate an overall plan for the organization by September. And certainly it will require our partners and stakeholders, the municipalities, buying into the concept to try and deliver some way of impacting our ratepayers and taxpayers of the Comox Valley and providing meaningful changes. The problem with many of our services, they're lean and mean as it is, and there's really little or no fat there. So it is coming up with things that have some implication on our service level, but I can assure you that we've really put our mind to the impacts of these suggestions, and they are modest. We still will continue to have a good, thorough watershed protection plan. The concepts that we're coming up with here, the modest savings of 100,000 are only the most less impactful. Some of that is as the result that we just can't have regular communications with the school system and outreach at this time too. So some of these deferrals just make sense in terms of the community's ability to respond to our programs.
So Russell, if we approve this recommendation today, as it's stated, do the electoral service areas then go back, come up? Like, I'm just wondering how we could proceed and give them that freedom.
Yeah, the electoral area services will be receiving their renewal plan and framework for their water systems, I think in early August. So definitely we will be bringing to their attention at that time the implications of this so that they can respond. The other thing I heard too is you might want from us a different strategy in terms of what was presented here in terms of the rates. If you want us to come back with another alternative to this water committee before it is finalized before the board, we do have that opportunity for us to come back and say, look at a staggered, so there isn't that dramatic increase in the year where it goes from 80 to 96. So we do have time at this committee to look at alternatives as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, excuse me. I think that might be useful as well to look at something that's more linear. So we still get the savings, but for those that are in the electoral areas, they don't have that huge jump and without the ability to smooth it out on their own. So I'd be interested in seeing that. Otherwise, I think what's come through is quite fair and in a sense impressive. I did have a quick question about the water conservation rebates, and maybe in particular, if we could just hear which ones those might be, what sort of rebates won't we be offering going forward?
Sure. Yeah, so our existing single rebate that's in place is for the smart irrigation controller. So that's a $300 rebate for properties that have installed a controller that has a smart function on it that measures rainfall and adjusts the extent of irrigation accordingly. So we were planning to roll out a soil and mulch rebate modeled after one that the RDN has been using successfully for a number of years. So we had all that documentation developed and ready to go this spring, but we've delayed that rollout given the COVID. So moving forward, once the dust settles, we do plan and hope to roll that rebate out. It's been shown to be very effective at reducing water consumption to increase the depth of topsoil and mulch in gardens. Yeah, so previously we had retired a rebate for low flush toilets that ran for 9 years. I think that the last year was 2018. So last year and this year, the only ones in place are that smart irrigation controller.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think my question was partially answered by Russell. I wanted a little bit more specifics on what the impacts would be to the watershed protection plan, and I understand that with schools and the education programs scaled back. Is there anything else aside from maybe the education component that you see being impacted with that reduction to the watershed protection plan?
Yeah, so the other big line item that formed about half of that $100,000 saving was essentially pressing pause on our proper functioning condition assessment. So we have previously allocated $50,000 a year And that's working with a specialized consultant that goes through and does detailed surveys of the tributaries to assess where there's potential need for restoration, where areas of particular sensitivity or that are contributing to the quality of water in the watershed. So that type of thing. So this is a multi-year endeavor to gradually and eventually cover kind of the entire watershed. So we're just getting started on that process. We're on year 3 of that. So what the implications here would be, pressing pause would be that we would defer completion of that program by 2 years. But it is in itself a 10 or 15 year program. So that's the other impact, in addition to the a portion of the education and outreach. So just to be clear, we're not proposing to eliminate education and outreach component, but rather reduce it. So we're still planning to continue to support and develop the curriculum component. You'll be dialing back on our more of our social media and communications type of element of that approach for the duration of this recovery.
Right, and I see that it does go back up to the current level a couple years down the road.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right, and then Director Greaves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question is through to Crystal Rose. Just to put a sense of perspective on everything, you were saying that we were trying to determine earlier on and didn't really get the straight answer, but if we're talking about 10 cent per cubic meter raise overall, say hypothetically, what does the average household use in terms of cubic meters in a year? I seem to remember about 280 or something like that.
So the average household barely exceeds the allotment within the flat rate. So they get 15 cubic meters per month in their flat rate. So that's 15 times 12 would be, so in other words, the average household uses approximately 170 cubic meters per year, just essentially just using up the allotment in the flat rate. So if a 10 cent increase to the bulk water rate, if we follow our practice to date, would just be reflected in the volumetric unit rate, which is only costs incurred by users that are using over their monthly allotment,
yeah.
15 cubic meters. Yeah.
But in other words, it's fairly minimal when it boils right down to it over a year's consumption, unless you're using exceptional amount. And then, of course, in the electoral areas, we have special rates for people in with the farm status, so that also helps them along as well. So I'm thinking we're spending a lot of time on this. In reality, it doesn't amount to too much money. And getting back to contribution to reserves, I've been reading about the Great Depression, and it took at least 3 years from the time the stock market crashed until they started maximizing their amount of unemployment when people were really hitting the skids. So this is going to be a long haul. Thank you.
And then, oh, well, you're out. Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions.
I'll ask a quick one.
Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, so in that same vein, I imagine that Courtney might see some savings at 3 cents based on the amount that we use. So do you happen to know the kind of numbers, like what would the savings be for the city of Courtney over a year? Would it be enough to build a bike lane or something else?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that estimate in my head. I mean, it's fairly significant, but a portion of that $500,000, so a fraction. So Courtney uses approximately 60% of the water. So you could, as a rough estimate, roughly 60% of the $500,000.
Yeah, so all joking aside, it is a significant number for our municipality, and it is an amount that could be used to offset our costs or lower our taxation to our taxpayers. So I think it it could play out positively for the municipalities and our ability to budget come next year. So keep
I
that in
think
mind.
there's enough to build a bridge.
Or if
I'm
it's
not
enough to do a
sure.
bridge, very excited.
Doug, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to support the staff recommendation. I think that staff put a lot of work into this, and we can't make any significant difference without a little bit of pain. I don't have a problem with looking at some type of graduated rise, but I'm not sure whether that extra staff work is really commensurate with the benefit that it gains, given the significance of even that 11 cents in year 3 or 4. So yeah, thanks to staff for the work on it, and I'm willing to support it going forward.
So I just want to be clear, if we pass this today in its form, the electoral areas could go look at theirs and have it different than ours so that they could mitigate some of those issues.
Their strategy for how they mitigate it, if they perceive it to be a problem, might be different or unique to them. But as Director Grieve pointed out, and Chris's response to that, it's for the most part, it is minimal because of the baseline amount that the most users get, and it is a hit that the users that use more water or over and above their base amount that will feel the effects, and that all encourages conservation.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry, I don't see any other hands or lights on, so is anyone opposed to receipt? And I don't see anyone, so we'll carry that. And then if someone wants to make a motion that, and the recommendation is that the COVID-19 response and renewal action plan for the Comox Valley water system, as included with the staff report dated July 9th, July 9th, 2020 be approved.
So moved.
So that's been moved and seconded. And any comments? I don't see any lights on, so we'll go through the roll and we will start with Director Cole Hamilton.
In favor.
And then Director Hillian.
In favor.
Greaves.
In favor.
And Director Moran.
In favor.
Director Hamir.
In favor.
Director Arbor.
In favor.
It's that the tomato can over to Hornby Island, it's got a wire missing there somewhere. Director Frisch.
In favor.
And Director Swift.
In favor.
And I'm in favor, so that passes. We will move on to water restriction updates. So staff report dated June 24th, 2020 regarding proposed updates to the Comox Valley Water Conservation Bylaw in response to the stage 4 water restrictions implemented in 2019 during the major repair to our transmission line for receipt.
Move it.
Second.
And then Russell, did you want to?
Sure.
Introduction?
Thank you, Chair and committee members. You remember that last crisis that we faced with the water system when we were short of water and went into stage 4 restrictions due to a repair. Jake Martins has a report here and will answer your questions with respect to our response of altering or amending the stage 4 restrictions based on the input we received.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson, and through the chair to the committee members. Yes, as Mr. Dyson mentioned, back in January 2019, I'm sure the committee members will recall the significant leak that was discovered on the Puntledge River in one of the regional district's main transmission lines. In order to ensure sufficient volume, stage 4 water restrictions were implemented during the duration of the repair, which took place between April 12th and 22nd. During those restrictions, some considerable concern and confusion was expressed by the business community, and as a result, the CVRD hired a consultant to undertake a business engagement survey. The results of this work were presented to the Water Committee back in November of 2019, and since then, staff have taken a close look at the recommendations in the report and brought forward some suggested amendments to the bylaw. So with respect to those suggested amendments, the changes proposed include clarifying the enforcement requirements, particularly when bylaw enforcement officers are entering onto property to ascertain whether the regulations are being met. Also, the applicability of indoor water use and the use of recycled or rainwater. Also confirming the ability to implement further measures if necessary within stages 3 and 4. and including a list of prohibited uses, mainly for information purposes, just to make it clear or more clear to those businesses what activities are prohibited. And finally, we've replaced a significant amount of the legalese provided within the bylaw and tried to replace that with some greater plain language and improve the formatting of that bylaw. So the report also touched on the economic impact of restricting water use on commercial operations. And so staff have looked at that from both a legal and practical perspective and have come to the conclusion that including the commercial operations is necessary when maintaining critical supply and levels are threatened to the community. Aligned with this notion, we have proposed a enforcement policy that would focus our limited bylaw resources on those high volume water users during those critical times when water supply is restricted. With that, I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
All right, Director Hillian.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to staff for the work involved in this and also the way it's presented, which enables us to see what's actually been changed. My question relates to the list of restrictions on page 17, where it says prohibited except for human and animal consumption, hygiene, safety, food and beverage, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just not 100% clear whether the hygiene, the safety and et cetera refers to animals as well as humans. And it may seem silly, but it's one reason I'm asking is to clarify the punctuation. Another reason I'm asking is because it seems to me one of the main complaints we had last time around was it was okay to wash hair, but it wasn't okay to wash dogs. So, and I don't see any specific reference to pets in this. So I just wondered whether that actually means prohibited except for human and animal consumption, human and animal hygiene, human and animal safety, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks through the chair to Director Hillian. Yeah, this was a significant concern that was raised during the restrictions, and my understanding, I'd invite my colleague Chris Alosa to jump in here to add any further clarity, is that hygiene was raised as an issue as if an animal is quite dirty or a pet, that can then cause a hygiene issue for those individuals that care for or that pet is within the household. Also, it can present an issue for anyone handling an animal at various times. So, Chris, I'll just invite if you have any comments on how that was treated during the restrictions and if that then provides us some knowledge going forward with future implementation.
Sure, yeah, as through the chair, as Jake mentioned, for some reason we got a lot of calls from dog washers during the stage 4 implementation last year. So I think our desire is to allow that use in the future, partially because of the justification we heard from residents, but also partially because they were so vocal. But I think the intention would be to include that within the hygiene section. So I think it could read human hygiene here. However, there's a human hygiene argument for allowing dog washing, given that dirty animals in a home can cause a human hygiene problem.
Okay, so thanks for that. Is the language or the communication related to it clear enough so that people who operate, pet washing operations are really clear about it?
Yeah, I think what we struggled with a little bit was striking a balance here in terms of the level of detail. I think Jake's done a really good job here. I think, that being said, I think it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to go into a subsequent stage 4 implementation and not have a lot of inquiries coming in. So I think we probably would get inquiries. I think one of our key takeaways from this process is that we just need to have, I think this improved bylaw and the attached policy will help us to be more consistent in the language and the responses that we and our municipal partners use during a future implementation.
And then Director Morin.
Great, thank you, Chair. Yeah, Director Hillian kind of brought up what I was going to address, and I think it was a combination of a lot of dog groomers being impacted and then also not having notice. They had very little notice, so they weren't able to adapt their practices or their scheduling to try to mitigate the financial losses. I know some of them did experience really significant losses. I did attend the Chamber of Commerce hosted kind of roundtable or whatever with some of the business owners. So I heard from them firsthand about that. And sadly, many of those small businesses are being really impacted by COVID as well. So I think as much clarity as possible, and certainly I think, you know, we might think it's humorous that animals hygiene would affect humans, but it can and does. If you've ever taken your dog to roll in, you know, dead anything, brought them back into the home. So I guess my other question is around the notice. I know that was another, not just by dog groomers, but other businesses felt that there wasn't enough notice given, et cetera. So I think that was addressed in the bylaw, but if I could have some clarification on that, it would be great. Thanks.
Sure, yeah, I can speak to the notice. So last year's implementation of stage 4 was our first as an organization. It's a very unusual and hopefully very rare event. There's a range of possible situations that could result in implementation of a stage 4. You know, we've got one that's come up recently during our negotiations with BC Hydro and the province for under our new water license associated with the treatment plant. So that's one situation, you know, where there's a large drought, a heavy drought year, where water consumption water flow down the river is being progressively reduced, and it goes down to a dire situation. So in that situation, we would have plenty of notice. We would be able to communicate that it's a possibility. However, most of the other possible instances would be very sudden. So there's no ability to commit to a specific notice for this. You know, it could be that we have a main break, you know, that the main that we repaired under the puntledge suffered a catastrophic failure, which would immediately put us into a dire situation in terms of water supply, depending on the pipe underneath the 5th Street Bridge. Knock on wood. Yeah, there are other situations, most of which are emergency. So we wouldn't be able to commit to a notice, a specific amount of notice, but certainly we can commit to providing as much notice as possible. So last year we had about a week and a half or 2 weeks of notice, which in the scheme of things would be, I would say, it would be unlikely in the future that we would be able to provide that much notice. And even so, you know, that lack of notice, that perceived lack of notice, when people are used to us communicating quite proactively about stage 3 and the shift to stage 3 in September, was still very problematic for people.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got about 13 minutes and we still have an in-camera section to go. So if everybody's okay, is there anyone opposed to receipt? And seeing none, we can move along. And all right.
Second.
Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll poll the audience here. So we'll start with Director Swift.
In favor?
And then Frisch.
In favor.
Arbor.
Yeah.
Whoa, okay. And then Hamir.
In favor.
Warren.
In favor.
Greaves.
In favor.
Killian.
Jawohl.
Cole Hamilton.
In favor.
And I'm also in favor. And there's a second recommendation if someone would like to move that.
Move recommendation 2.
Second.
Seconded. And any discussion on that? Seeing none, we will do the reverse poll. We'll go Cole Hamilton this time.
In favor.
and Greaves,
In favor?
Moran,
In favor.
Amir,
In favor.
Barber,
Yes.
Frisch,
In favor.
myself in favor, and Swift.
In favor?
Okay, so there we are.
Move the in-camera resolution.
And
Second.
that's section 90 of acquisition and disposal of land. So seconder,
Yep, second.
second, and anyone opposed to going in camera? Seeing none, away we go.